Welcome to the Low Carb Athlete Podcast, where we focus on discussing topics to help you burn fat, optimize health, and improve performance in life and sports. Transform the whole you from the inside out with the holistic method. Let's dive in. Here's your host, Debbie Potts.
Hey everybody, it's Debbie Potts, and I'm doing a part 2 with Ryan Monahan, FDN practitioner, medical director consult. We have often together on organic acids test, which you've probably heard many times. People talk about it a lot on our different podcasts. If you listen to health building podcasts, on the oats test. And Ryan's my go-to guy to review oat test results when we're doing FDN investigative work with clients. We run 3 to 5 different labs and correlate all that information together and help that client. That we do not treat the lab results and just we treat the whole person. So Ryan, we did a podcast a month ago and I got him back on the show. I just wanted to use my lab test as an example because I have permission for myself to give to you to share my data. So if you guys are watching the video version, I'll show my lab test on the organic acids test I did earlier this summer. So Ryan, thank you for coming on the show. Let's kind of give a brief review of why you're the expert in the organic acids test for our FDN practitioners.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I love geeking out on organic acids, and I really got into looking at those tests in particular because it took me many years to come to realize this, but I was living in a house with a significant mold issue. So that led me down this rabbit hole of trying to uncover some of these deeper stressors in the body that might be contributing to my autoimmune condition. I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's back in 2012. And that ultimately led me to discover the organic acid test, which in my opinion is hands down the most important test you want to run if you suspect a mold issue in your clients, a mold colonization, right? So if you're working with someone that has had a history of living in a home with water damage or leaks, plumbing leaks, if they smell a musty smell in their house, there's a number of things to look out for. Most obvious would be seeing visible mold throughout the house, like black mold. But it's not always going to be visible. It's not always going to have a scent. So that's where you have to kind of correlate it back. And oftentimes, people dealing with full-blown mold illness, mold colonization, and mycotoxins in their system, they're going to be among some of the sickest of your clients, right? These people coming to you with a laundry list of symptoms, everything from chronic fatigue, brain fog, weight gain, various different autoimmune diagnoses, fibromyalgia. The list is actually really, really pretty long when you're talking about mold issues. This is why actually Dr. Richie Shoemaker, who's considered to be sort of the grandfather of mold illness, he characterized CIRS, which is chronic inflammatory response syndrome. It's kind of the technical term for mold illness. He characterized it as a multi-system, multi-symptom illness, meaning that his mold patients in his patient population had these laundry lists of symptoms, right? Often, more than 6 to 8 chronic symptoms, sometimes 12 chronic main health challenges or complaints that were affecting everything from cognition to energy to sleep issues, seemingly all maybe even unrelated, but in actuality sharing a common root cause in the fact that it was their environment that was making the person sick in that case. So I'm really passionate about this subject because I was really chronically fatigued and depressed and brain fogged and all those things that commonly come across with mold illness for many, many years, nearly a decade, until I came to realize that it was actually a mold issue. But up till that point, I just hadn't been, that's something I hadn't come across, wasn't very educated about. So now, I want to really try to help other people prevent having to live through the nightmare that I lived through.
In 10 years, that's a long time. And I always think of how many people are out there listening that, most of our listeners are athletes, but might not correlate that there's something else going on if you're not able to lose weight, burn fat, if you're not able to feel your best every day and thrive. And if your athletic performance is going downhill suddenly, like mine was, top age group athlete, top Ironman Hawaii, and then 3 months later, I had no energy and I gained 30 pounds and I couldn't even ride my bike without having to stop and pull over. So I think there's a
Mhm.
lot of red flags that we ignore or don't see because we're not having that awareness of. So, which is my goal now with the podcast, to talk about more of these health building ideas and how we can do lab testing and really see, are you fit and healthy on the inside and out? And I think a lot of people look great on the outside. They might be lean, strong, be able to go swim, bike, run really long distances, great endurance athlete, but they're actually struggling and they might not know about it, or they might do and they don't want to admit it. So that's what we're going to kind of dive into, the organic acid test, one again of 3 to 5 different tests that we would have someone do, because one test, as we'll probably find out from Ryan today, that you'll get clues from looking at one test, and then we'd want to ideally see, okay, does this correlate with the data on a GI map or BiomeFX and food sensitivity, stuff like that, nutrient deficiencies.
Mhm.
So Ryan, what does chronic stress, is it, stress is an issue for a lot of people, but you're like brain fog and all these things. How would you kind of figure out that it'd be mold? Is it get to a point to run a lab test like this when people have tried all different other solutions and they just like come to a conclusion that there must be something else out there that I just can't. I'm trying to do all the right things and I just can't feel good. I feel chronically stressed. I feel anxious. I have slow recovery. And to really realize it could just be mold that's causing all these huge amount of symptoms. It's just,
Yeah, and that was definitely me for many years. I had done so many of the different gut healing protocols. I had done heavy metal detox protocols. I had done a lot of work. I'd done an autoimmune protocol diet, and I had the foundations there. The diet, rest, exercise, stress reduction, but I was still hitting a major wall with my symptoms. In particular, my chronic allergies. It was just constant sinus infections and postnasal drips and sneezing over 100 times a day. Like
mhm.
no joke. Like sometimes, not that I ever counted, but I would not be surprised if it was like over 100 or 200 times a sneezing throughout the day. So I was constantly on Benadryl and nasal sprays and steroids, prednisone, right, would often be the only thing that would alleviate my chronic sinusitis. So that in itself can be a clue. If you're working on all that kind of lower hanging fruit with a client and you're laying down those foundations, you should see a reasonable amount of progress. If you're not and they're stuck, it may be a deeper level issue, like a mold issue. So that in itself may clue you in to looking for or investigating a mold issue.
Mhm.
Sometimes it might be really obvious, like a client might tell you right off the bat, oh yeah, like I suspect I have a mold issue. I lived in a moldy basement in my friend's house, or I lived in a moldy dorm room or something like that. And then, like I mentioned earlier, if you're seeing someone that comes to you with like a half a dozen to a dozen chronic symptoms, that in itself is a clue for mold illness, because of the nature of mold affecting multiple systems throughout the body. So if I see that type of person that's just chronically ill and they're overweight, they're fatigued, they've got autoimmune conditions, they've got gut dysfunction and GI symptoms, you can go on and on with it. But those types of people, that's usually a sign that there could be a mold issue going on. And I would want to start with, asking some of these questions about their environmental exposure or even their history of exposure, and then including an OAT test in the foundational labs to see what we find.
Because I feel like, for me as example, and I know other people like this, that they had adrenal fatigue in the beginning, or, adrenal exhaustion in certain states. So their hormones are tanked, their cortisol levels really high, adrenal fatigue, and then they continued living life as a race and broke themselves down more and had exhaustion. So their hormones were all depleted. We call HP access dysfunction, dysregulation, but that could be not just your crazy lifestyle. It could be also a contributor as mold toxicity. Could
Yeah,
be a big
it's
part
such
of
an
it.
important point too, because for all of those years when I was dealing with chronic illness, I really internally beat myself up over it, because I had always thought it was for a lack of willpower. that I couldn't get up and exercise, or that if I ran a quarter mile, that I started to become out of breath, right? Which is totally not normal, right? But I just could not push myself to exercise. I just didn't even have the energy, right? Which is kind of self-reinforcing. If you're not working on the body, that can impact all kinds of things. Yeah, it really highlights how multifactorial this mold issue can be, and can really impact your energy in a highly significant way, even despite you dieting and exercising, and even trying to mind your adrenal health, right? So sometimes it goes way deeper than that, in terms of there being hidden stress in the body, right? Is what we call it as FDNs, right? These are deep physiological stressors that go just beyond our ability to power through it or to use willpower to have enough energy throughout the day. Like, there was nothing I could have done to overcome my chronic fatigue or my lack of energy or my lack of exercise resilience, had I not uncovered this mold issue, period. There's nothing I could have done until I addressed that.
And for me, as an example, we'll share my lab test, but for 8 years, I've been doing all sorts of different things, and I definitely feel a lot better, but I can't go run a marathon. I can't go do an Ironman again, probably because I just still struggle with that longer distance without getting fatigued and being slow and sluggish. But it's fascinating to me, which is why I want to do a podcast on mold toxicity, is that for the past 10 years, I owned a fitness studio, and I was bottom floor, and we always had ceilings leaking and floods from the yoga studio above me and the restaurant that was on the other side. I'd like once a month or every couple months have the ceiling tiles stained and water on the floor, and just never thought of it. They replaced the tile, but I'm in there, every day, Monday through Friday, and Saturday sometimes, and I'm breathing this in. So there's all these different things you start to go back in time when you get your test back. Okay, I had mold toxicity. How did that happen? And also I started thinking we had our dishwasher flooded and the floor got all damaged. And then our shower, when we first moved in our house 13 years ago, the water from the rain through the roof came through the shower, and the ceiling fell down. So you start to think of all these different things you would never correlate together. It's like, mold toxicity, how do I have mold in my house? But then you're like, oh yeah, you start to go back and go a little deeper into your life. So
Yep.
Anything you want to add, and I'll share the screen and we can go through some pointers of how we look at it.
Yeah, just really quickly to add to your point about this kind of water damage or plumbing leaks that you might see in the house.
Mm-hmm.
That it only takes about 30 minutes for mold to start growing when there's moisture, right? And that just highlights how common and prevalent these mold issues are. There was a recent assessment that I read that indicated that up to 43% of homes in the United States have some degree of a mold issue. So this is not like a super fluke thing. This is not like a rare thing that you're not going to find often. And it's unfortunate, but the reality that I see is that a large portion of my clients, maybe up to a third or more, are dealing with some degree of mold or fungal colonization. That's not to say that every single one of them is in this deep state of full-blown mold illness or dysfunction, but that to some extent mold may be playing a picture for a lot more people than you may realize.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to bring this up to people, that just because you're an athlete and you're fit on the outside, you need to get these labs done with a FDN practitioner that will look at all this together, rather than, for years I saw 10 different doctors, naturopaths, no one ever gave me this, but all the other lab work I had done, they would still just treat the lab results. And that's what sets FDN practitioners apart, is that we treat the person and we put all this together to create a dress for health success protocol that we find working on lifestyle changes. Because if you don't, like as you said, change your environment and living in an environment of mold, and you start to do some mold detox protocol, you're still breathing it in. So how important it is to work on our nutrition, our sleep, our exercise, stress reduction, and I always add in gratitude, happiness, and laughter, and that lifestyle habits we need to work on, but it all correlates together.
I love that you added those in there. So important.
Yeah. For sure. The holistic method I created over 5 years ago, just over time, just starts, okay, there's all these things that we need to really work on to be healthy. And it's not just exercise and nutrition, but it's gut health and digestion and movement throughout the day. Because even if you just ran 5-8 miles in the morning, but you sat on your rear end all day on your computer, you still need movement and mobility drills. So that's such an important thing. But I think this year with COVID year, I'm really big into making sure everyone's doing something that makes them laugh and smile each day and being silly and writing in a gratitude journal every night, because that's all working on our stressors externally that we can control. Internally, we're finding these hidden stressors that can all accumulate. And, we can look at my other podcast I did with Karan, look at my Biome FX lab, looking at my microbiome, but how mold toxicity can affect our additional hidden internal stressors that can accumulate and I'm sure cause dysbiosis or contribute or lead to, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So let's dive into this, because I think it's good eye opener for people that are athlete of any level, just athlete or not, it doesn't really matter, but how to get this data and correlate it with really how you feel if you want to be healthy and live your best life.
Let's do it. Yeah, let's dive in and take a look at these organic acid test results. So I'll just start off by giving a very quick analogy and explanation, maybe for those who aren't familiar with this test. And I like to reference this test as kind of like being an emissions test, like that you would do for your car, but except we're doing an emissions test for the body. So like an emissions test for the car, you'd be looking for certain particulates or exhaust matter to be coming out of the exhaust pipe of your car, right? And if there are certain fumes or metabolites, I'm not a car mechanic, as you can tell. I'm not even sure if I'm using the right terminology. But what I do know is that if certain metabolites are building from the exhaust, that tells you that, of course you fail the emissions test, but that also tells you there's something wrong with the engine that needs to be repaired so that those metabolites or those fumes or toxins, whatever you want to call them, that are no longer showing up. So the reason that is a good analogy for the OAT test is because we're not, for most of these markers, we're not really actually measuring anything directly. We're measuring these indirect metabolites. So if we start off by looking through these first microbial markers in the yeast and fungal section.
Let me just add in, I forgot to say it's a urine test. So yes, if people aren't familiar, it's metabolic markers in the urine, and we do this first thing in the morning and take your urine. So just to explain how it's done. Go ahead.
Awesome. Perfect. Yeah, thank you for adding that in. So we're looking at, say, for example, these first 9 markers like citramalic acid. Some of these have some pretty crazy names, like number 4 is furan 2,5-dicarboxylic acid, right? So what is that? It's a metabolite of aspergillus, which is a type of mold. And aspergillus actually happens to be one of the most common household molds to grow in an environment where there's moisture or water damage, right? So you'll see a number of aspergillus metabolites on there. There's also metabolites here for candida, which can also be a type of yeast that can grow in a home with water damage. So we were actually just talking about that before the podcast, that sometimes people think they can out-diet their way out of candida, but if you're being exposed to it in your home as part of a water-damaged home where there's a mold issue, you might not be able to fully address that candida until you've remediated the issue in the home, right? So another thing to point out, that these gold bars, they're kind of orange, yellow, gold colored bars, that represents the optimal range or the first standard deviation, which in statistics means that about 68% of the population will normally fall in that gold bar range. So if you're seeing this diamond, which represents the actual client values, and they're red, that means that's highly clinically significant and that they're highly elevated. So if we actually look at the ones that are super high in this example, number 3, which is the oxoglutaric acid marker, that can be highly correlated with black mold in the home, right? So maybe, for example, Stachybotrys is a pretty common type of black mold that might be growing in your bathroom, say, for example. So that can indicate that there's currently an overgrowth of various different species of black mold in the gut environment. And that black mold is producing this oxoglutaric acid, which is showing up in the urine. So again, we're looking at like these exhaust metabolites. We're not looking at anything directly here. So we can also see via that tartaric acid marker, number 6, there may be some aspergillus mold overgrowth. And like I said, that's going to be the most common type of mold in the home. Then the arabinose marker is a metabolite of candida. And this is interesting too. When you see markers 6 and 7, tartaric and arabinose, and they're elevated together, that's typically like a home run for candida, right? So tartaric acid can also be a metabolite of candida. So that's where understanding the nuances of the test can be helpful, because with a handful of these markers, when they're elevated, it can mean more than one thing. So, you know, you do have to kind of do a lot of clinical correlation and critical thinking when you're looking at an O test.
Well, that's why FDN practitioners meet with the medical director have a consultation with the medical director to go over the labs. So we're being able to have other people that focus on, as yourself with organic acids test, to be the expert in it, to see that. So we're not the expert in everything. So you always have to have someone else's eyes.
The coolest parts about FDN is you get all that ongoing support after you graduate.
Yes. So those are the yeast and fungal markers. So there's definite signs of black mold, asparagus mold, and then candida.
Yep. Yeah, so this kind of just paints an overall picture of a moldy gut environment, right? And so again, we always want to trace that back to whether they're being exposed to mold in the home, because that's the primary source of mold exposure and colonization, right? So you can breathe these mold spores in, and they make their way into the GI tract, and they can colonize.
So this is the measurement. So they're coming from that you have mold overgrowth in your GI tract, but also nasal, because you inhale it off too, but that's not probably measured as much as in the organic acids test.
To some extent, they may be. Yeah, it may be partially reflective of systemic mold overgrowth. And sinus issues are really, really common. Actually, the Mayo Clinic has said that I believe it's 95 or 96% of cases of chronic sinusitis are fungal related. So if you're someone that's dealt with chronic sinus infections and constant allergies and runny nose your entire life, like I was, and it's never been resolved with antibiotics or surgeries or prednisone or anything like that, or nasal sprays, it's probably because it's actually fungal colonization, fungal and mold colonization in your sinuses. And you need to address it as a fungal and mold issue, not antibiotics aren't going to do anything. So depending on the presentation, some individuals, in addition to needing to take some antifungals, may also need to do some nasal sprays as well to kill off the fungal and mold out of their sinuses.
But not the kind that you buy at the drugstore, nasal spray, right?
Probably not, right? Like in the holistic world, I'm a big fan of using colloidal silver nasal sprays. I've found those to be pretty highly effective. But in more severe issues, like in my case, actually, I visited a really renowned mold doctor in Atlanta, and we actually had an MRI done, and he identified fungal colonies like far up in the sinuses.
Wow.
He actually had to inject antifungal medication way deep up in the sinuses. It was actually so far up that it was near my pituitary gland.
Whoa.
So you want to think about the correlation between mold and thyroid issues, right?
Whoa.
Yeah, pretty nuts. So in that instance, it required some medical attention, and he injected an antifungal drug called amphotericin, and it was incredibly effective.
That would hurt. That doesn't sound good, having something injected up your nose or anywhere.
No, it was pretty quick and painless.
Wow.
Definitely worth it. Yeah.
Good. Okay, bacterial markers on the organic acids test, and the number 11 is elevated here, and then number 10 is kind of trending elevated. What would you see here that correlates to?
Yeah, so that might look like there's some degree of bacterial overgrowth or dysbiosis in the gut. And often, if I really want to be confident that there's some bacterial overgrowth, I'm usually wanting to see at least, 2 of these markers elevated. If there's just one elevation, it doesn't give you a 100% clear correlation. But what you can do, if you wouldn't mind, if you scroll down to marker 61, that marker also correlates well with bacterial overgrowth. So let's take a look and see if that one is elevated as well. In this case, it's not, right? So it's not really like a clear indication that there's GI bacterial overgrowth there. So like I said, many of these markers, and I won't go too into depth here because I want to stay on topic with mold, but many of these markers can be kind of vague or fuzzy. That's kind of how I put it, meaning that elevations in some of these metabolites can be due to different issues. Like, for example, you might see hippuric acid, that marker number 10. That could be elevated with bacterial overgrowth. You might see it elevated with ammonia toxicity in the body. You might see that elevated where there's imbalances between your phase 1 and phase 2 liver detoxification. So again, correlation is key, always kind of tying it back to clients' symptom history and presentation.
Yeah, that's why I love this stuff. It is being a health investigator and putting the missing pieces of the puzzle together, as we always say, because that's what we're doing. It's like you put all the pieces of the puzzle apart and then start to figure out what goes with what.
Absolutely.
So another
protective. And yeah, what we're seeing in terms of the rest of this first page is that there's no significant, other than that marker 11, no obvious signs of bacterial overgrowth, no signs of Clostridia overgrowth either. Now the next section, as you're scrolling down, is going to be the oxalate metabolism section. Okay, so what we're seeing here is an elevation in oxalic acid or oxalate. So oxalate is actually a toxin produced by mold, right? And this is one of the ways that mold and fungal species can protect themselves in the natural environment. So what we're seeing here, this will often go hand in hand when you have mold colonization in your gut, that these mold and fungal species are producing this metabolite, or a toxin really, called oxalic acid. And if you look at a picture of oxalate under a microscope, it is a very sharp, jagged structure, right? It could also bind up to minerals like calcium, for example, and form calcium crystals, calcium oxalate crystals, which can form kidney stones, right? So actually, if you see someone with a history of kidney stones, that can also be a sign of mold colonization or mold illness. So that's going to be the primary reason of kidney stones, is actually this excess of oxalate. So because of that jagged, sharp structure of oxalate, it's going to be highly associated with symptoms of chronic pain, are going to be really common, muscle and joint pain, because these oxalate crystals can lodge themselves into joints and muscle and tissue. Oxalates can also cause micro tearing to the mucosal barrier, the lining of your intestinal tract. And so oxalates can also result in leaky gut. They can also cause damage to mitochondria, and that's where you're seeing, like, for example, that elevation in marker number 24, the succinic acid. What we're seeing there is that it's possible that oxalates are interfering with mitochondrial function. And this is one of many reasons why one of the hallmark symptoms of mold illness is chronic fatigue. It's probably maybe one of the most common. Chronic fatigue syndrome, CFS, brain fog, cognition issues, memory impairment. What can happen as well is when you have mold colonization, and not only do the mold and fungal species produce oxalate, but they also produce these toxins called mycotoxins. And mycotoxins are highly, highly inflammatory. They're highly immune suppressive. They can also be carcinogenic and immunotoxic and nephrotoxic, so toxic to the kidneys. But also they are so tiny on a micron scale that they can cross the blood-brain barrier. So these mycotoxins have an affinity for your fat cells in your brain. and they can cause a lot of inflammation in the brain. So it's not uncommon to see a lot of neurological symptoms with mold and mycotoxins. So yeah, in short, when we're looking at that oxalate marker, mold and oxalate go hand in hand, which is something that's not commonly known. A lot of people talk about oxalate in the diet, like from spinach, sweet potatoes, Swiss chard, some of these high oxalate containing foods. But in my experience and from what I've observed, it's much more common that someone will have an oxalate issue when they have mold colonization. It's not so much really that in my opinion that oxalates in the diet. I think it's a little bit overblown. I think oxalate problems are primarily a mold issue.
Interesting. Yeah, you hear a lot about oxalates, how they're not good for you.
Yeah.
But there's always look at the why.
That makes people afraid of eating vegetables. And and I'll tell you a little short story. When I first learned about oxalates and their connection to the diet, and I would see them high on the organic acid test, and I would put my clients on a low oxalate diet. And not only did they find that to be extremely stressful and restrictive, but I didn't really see much clinical benefit or results from going on a low oxalate diet. I really wasn't. It wasn't until I understood the connection with molds and addressed the oxalate issue at the source that I started seeing really dramatic improvements in someone's overall health. So that succinic acid marker, really quick, I'll just add a quick comment that that might be one of the most clinically relevant markers on the entire test for giving you a clue for generalized toxicity. So it's not going to tell you specifically what kind of toxicity we're dealing with. Could be mold toxins, could be heavy metals, could be pesticides, but it is telling you that there's a lot of toxicity going on when you see an elevation in that marker.
And then the other section, mitochondrial. So this is fine on me, but amino acid metabolites, some of them are trending higher. Anything we want to kind of correlate there with?
It's nothing too dramatic. If I see something that's just above the reference range, it may not be all that clinically relevant. If you see markers in that section 30 through 32, and they're more exaggerated elevations, it might be an indication of a number of different things. Could be a vitamin B1 deficiency, which often correlates with fatigue. You could be looking at deficiencies in branch chain amino acids, and that actually might be super relevant for if you're looking to optimize athletic performance.
Yeah.
I know, I think Ben Greenfield is really big into branch chain amino acids.
Not, yeah, branch chain, but amino acids, because there's the full ones. He's always not just the aminos, the essential amino acids, but all of them.
All of them, yep.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
The Keon aminos, I like actually drink that a lot. It's better than the big chalky tablets.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So number 35, we were talking about that earlier. How's that, when that's elevated, it correlates to some other markers?
Yeah, so when this gets a little more technical, so without going too deep into the neurochemistry or anything, what I'll say is that when there's an elevated ratio of HVA to VMA, what that typically indicates is that individual is not breaking down dopamine very effectively. That could often be due to something really simple, like a magnesium deficiency. That's usually one of the first things I'll try out when I see that ratio high. So, and just to clarify, when your dopamine is not being broken down very well, what happens is it builds up in the brain. And dopamine is a neuroexcitatory neurotransmitter. And it's in this category of other neurotransmitters called catecholamines. So that goes alongside dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine collectively. And these are all like basically our fight or flight neurotransmitters. So if you're not breaking down dopamine and these other neurotransmitters, these catecholamines, you're more likely to be stressed out, anxious, and kind of stuck in fight or flight. So it's really important that when you see this elevated ratio, that you help someone in terms of supporting their chemistry to help to drain these catecholamines out, right? We need to help the body break them down. And magnesium is going to assist the COMT enzyme, this catechol O-methyltransferase. That's the enzyme that's primarily responsible for breaking down dopamine and epinephrine. And you need magnesium as a cofactor to do that. So I often point this out to clients and I say, think about the millions of people that are on anti-anxiety drugs that might have benefited from just some therapeutic doses of magnesium to help with their anxiety, right? Like at least go for the low-hanging fruit before you go to this extreme of pharmaceuticals. That's just me. That's my opinion. Not to say that these drugs can't be extremely life-saving for
That's
some.
why we're in the functional medicine world, because we think makes more sense to start with that before you go straight to the pharmaceutical drugs.
Exactly. Yep. And that's really the only thing I'm seeing appearing on this section. Everything else looks good, but that high ratio is most likely an issue of breaking down dopamine.
And one more note too, this is why I like to just look at people, do my advanced coaching program, look at their genetic SNPs and look at Dr. Ben Lynch's dirty genes and say, okay, I have more chance of my comp gene to be dirty, so I need to be more aware of how I deal with stress and working on my vagal tone and doing deep nasal breathing and different exercises. But if you tend to be stuck in that fight or flight mode, and the comp gene is related to those hormones being the norepinephrine and epinephrine. So if you, I think that's a good correlation too to, okay, look at your genetic SNPs and look at your, life cell, your epigenetics, and then look at what's really going on right now in a snapshot of my body when I took this test.
Yep, exactly. And I have that homozygous mutation for COMT myself.
Mm-hmm.
So what that means is I have a genetic tendency to have higher levels of dopamine and be more prone to stress and anxiety.
Yes.
But since I've learned that, and that's been a key part of my healing journey, is that I'm mindful to take regular amounts of magnesium in maintenance doses, right? And since I've kind of sort of biohacked that issue to some extent, to use that term, I don't really have that issue anymore at all. And I also meditate and I go in the sauna as often as I can, and I try to be mindful of stress as it's coming up and to become aware of it and not let myself slip into some of those tendencies, right? So knowing some of that nutrigenomic information can help you better understand like how you can work with your own strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, that's what I love. We were just talking about Ben Lynch's dirty genes. This is my clean book, but they sent me a new one. My other book has so many tabs in it, but it's everything we talk about in nutritional therapy, and my holistic method and FDN practitioners is the DRESS protocol and working on, your nutrition, your exercise, sleep, and supplement as needed, but how to titrate it down based on paying attention to yourself. So it's good correlate that with your lab testing. Anyways.
And like you said earlier, Debbie, also, gratitude journaling, laughter, community, like these are all like really important things
especially in 2020.
I 100% agree.
Yeah. So I do, do magnesium every night, and I have my little sleep routine. I wrote a blog of a few weeks ago on my website and how I do essential oils and do the parasympathetic oil, vibrant blue oils mix on my vagal nerve behind my ear, and then I have a diffuser plug-in thing, and I write my gratitude journal every night, and I do a little yoga or yin yoga. Going to sleep, I always like to do my counting my box breathing or something to just shut my mind off, and it works. It's like a miracle way to have good quality sleep and to relax.
And a lot of these are simple habits too. Once we get in the routine of implementing them, don't even require all that much time.
I know. So I want to touch on these ones. We're just like 10 more minutes, but ketone fatty acid oxidation, I think, is an important one just for people that are trying to, being low carb keto, and it does tell us some information about your ability to burn fat. Because I think a lot of people go into a low carb, high fat diet and they have poor fat digestion. And so we'll see that come up in different tests. But How does this ketone fatty acid oxidation markers 43 to 49 give us any information of
Yeah,
fat?
so these markers might be relevant in correlating with the client's diet and lifestyle. For example, it's not uncommon to see elevations in hydroxybutyric acid and acetoacetic acid. Those are actual ketones. So you might see those elevated in someone that's doing a ketogenic diet, maybe someone that's fasting or intermittent fasting. And those elevations might just be reflective of that diet and lifestyle, right? So if you're using these approaches like fasting or ketogenic diets for a number of health issues, like we know ketogenic diets can help starve cancer cells. We know that it can help the body to burn fat more efficiently if someone's trying to improve insulin sensitivity or lose weight. You might want to see evidence that they're producing some ketones and that they're switching to being more of a fat burner than a glucose or a carbohydrate burner. And then these last three markers are interesting, the 47, 48, 49. If you're seeing elevations in those markers, it's indicative of a carnitine deficiency, specifically carnitine, which is an amino acid. And the role of that amino acid is to shuttle fatty acids into the cell where those fatty acids get burned up by the mitochondria to produce energy. So you might see a carnitine deficiency in someone dealing with weight loss issues. They're trying to lose weight, but despite their efforts, they cannot lose weight. It might also correlate with fatigue. Like if someone's not burning fat for energy, then they might be pretty tired. So it's really actually pretty fascinating because you see this kind of tired mantra of diet and exercise when it comes to weight loss, but there can be way more going on there, right? Like if someone's deficient in carnitine, they're not going to be burning fat very well.
Yeah, and that's another reason I love this test to correlate it with client symptoms, that if you're struggling doing all the right things and you're still not able to lose weight, burn fat, and you're still struggling with health and performance, and I think this is, good clues to figure out what's actually going on under the hood.
100%. Yep.
So nutritional markers are great to see too on here, and that kind of will correlate with what we can see in the Dutch test and like the BioMFX or GI map, another test to kind of put it all together. But on here, you can tell I supplement with B.
Yeah, this is interesting, right? So and some of these are sort of counterintuitive. Like if you look at marker 50, that's called methylmalonic acid. It's often abbreviated as MMA.
Backwards.
If that marker is elevated, it indicates a deficiency in B12.
Yeah.
Because remember, we're not measuring most of these markers directly. We're looking at these metabolites that build up when there's inefficiencies in the body. So that marker specifically correlates with a deficiency in methyl B12 or methylcobalamin. The reason that's important and that I highlighted that is because if you were to see this and say, oh, this person's deficient in B12, and you were to try to use like hydroxy B12 or adenosyl B12, they wouldn't work in this case, right? This is specifically a deficiency in the methylated form of B12. So in order to plug that hole, you need to use methyl B12 or methylcobalamin.
And I started taking it after I did this test because I stopped taking it, but I have the genetic SNPs too that I need to have more B12.
Right, like the MTR genes, MTR and MTRR, yeah. Yep, and so when you're deficient in B12, especially methyl B12, you're likely to have some methylation impairments going on as well, because I won't turn, I don't want to go too down a rabbit hole of methylation because it's a big topic. But like, let's make a really simple analogy and say like B12 is kind of like a key that you turn in the methylation cycle to get things moving. And so if you're deficient in B12, your methylation cycle and your methylation processes are going to be slowed down or not working optimally. And that's a problem. Methylation is a process that happens in every cell in your body. It helps your body to repair damaged DNA, helps you to synthesize neurotransmitters. Methylation also is responsible in part for your phase 2 liver detoxification. Actually, 80% of methylation happens in the liver. So if you're undermethylating, you're not going to be detoxing very well. So it's methylation, like I said, it's a big topic, but it's one of the most important metabolic processes in the body. If that gives you kind of a rough sense for how important it is.
Yeah, it's huge.
Huge, yep.
Yeah, so the other ones people can tell are B2, vitamin C, CoQ10, and NAC, biotin, which is vitamin H, people might not know.
Sometimes referred to as vitamin B7, actually, biotin.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So yeah, everything looks pretty good and normal to me here. That B5 elevation, usually that's only high if someone's supplementing with B5. So that's probably, you might have been taking it like in a multivitamin or something.
Yep.
Test, yeah.
Yes. And then I think the last page will kind of anything we need to touch on the last few minutes.
Yep. So glutathione here is glutathione, if you're not familiar, for your listeners, is the body's master antioxidant. Also extremely important for intracellular detoxification, for phase 2 liver detoxification. So when there's an elevation in this marker of pyroglutamate or pyroglutamic acid, that's telling you that there's a glutathione deficiency, and you're probably not detoxing very well, right? So that's super important when you see that, to restore glutathione status. Kind of connecting some dots too. We talked about when there's a B12 deficiency, you're probably undermethylating. And glutathione is a product of methylation. It's kind of ultimately one of the end products that's produced as a result of methylation processes. So if you are undermethylating, that may tie to a glutathione deficiency. So those are how those two topics may be correlated. Yeah, you definitely want to restore. And also, actually, let me add this, because we saw all the markers for mold on the first page. That's often highly going to correlate with a glutathione deficiency, because the mold toxins or the mycotoxins can actually interfere with the genes that and the enzymes that your body utilizes to make glutathione, right? So the mold toxins can directly inhibit your body's ability to make glutathione. So that actually may be tied to the mold issue. So it's kind of a catch-22, right? Because you need glutathione. Glutathione can conjugate, right? Can conjugate to mold toxins and excrete them out into the bile and for detoxification and elimination. So if you're deficient in glutathione, you could be kind of just like recirculating mold toxins back into your system.
That's not good.
Yeah, you're going to be kind of trapped.
Yeah. And then the last section, is this end of it? There. So the last page is the main one. People can get indicators of glutathione. We just went over amino acid metabolites,
Yep.
And then mineral metabolism. Anything we want to touch on related to mold toxicity?
Nothing too significant in terms of these markers. Just a couple quick things. The amino acid metabolites section was really designed by Dr. William Shaw to identify genetic abnormalities, especially in the autism population. So this section isn't going to correlate too much with looking at mold issues.
Got it.
And there's nothing too significant here, like no extreme elevations. The mineral metabolism section, phosphoric acid, this actually looks great on this particular test result. It's pretty common to see it low. I probably would say I see that maybe 80 to 90% of the time. And when that marker is low, and actually just to point this out too, for maybe 95% of the markers on this test, it's really only significant if the marker is over to the right. This is one of those exceptions. So if that diamond is over to the left, or if it's low, that is typically indicative of either a vitamin D or a vitamin K2 deficiency. They're really common because the average person eating a standard American diet and living a standard American lifestyle is probably not getting enough sunlight, not getting out in the sun enough, or not eating foods like cod liver oil or salmon or some of these other foods that are high in vitamin D.
Yeah, and I tried cod liver oil. I need to get it again and have it lemon because I got this bottle free at nutritional therapy conference. I won it, and it was not lemon. It was just the real thing, and I like damaged me from having it again. It's so horrible.
It's not
So,
the best thing. I'll usually, when I take cod liver oil, I'll chase it down with like a piece of dark chocolate or something to mask the
uh,
taste. But the Rosita brand, which is
yeah,
typically the
that
brand
was a brand,
oh
Rosita.
yeah, well, so they actually make a capsule version too.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely I advise taking a lemon or orange capsule or just
yeah,
a
exactly.
spoonful
Yeah.
with something else. But yeah, so thanks, Ryan. I think that's a lot of good information and just give example of how we as FDN practitioners work as health investigators and really look at the whole person to help figure out how to bring them back to optimal levels, homeostasis to balance, but really the goal is to get everyone to thrive each day, not just survive the day. And being healthy, working on performance longevity should be key for everyone. And I always, became an FDN practitioner myself because I feel this importance of working on your nutrition and all those lifestyle habits, but we don't really know what's actually going on. Like for me, mold toxicity until I did this test that no one ran on me for the 8 years I was struggling. So like your 10 years, my 8 years, you don't want to waste that time. That's a lot of time trying to figure out what's actually going on. But if you got someone to get the right combination of lab tests and a health practitioner, as FDN practitioners do, to really figure out what is your protocol to heal and rebuild and restore the whole you back to how you should feel every day and not settle.
Yeah, all such important points. Yep. And I mean, who wouldn't want to live an optimal life, right? I don't want to just be surviving. I want to be thriving.
Yeah.
And if I were to
Fun.
go back in time, not to say I have any regrets, but I wish I had known a lot of this information sooner about mold and organic acid testing and mold toxins and how they can be such a significant driver of inflammation and immune suppression. Because I often say when I'm talking about my own health journey that I basically lost like a decade of my life to chronic
Mhm.
fatigue, chronic illness.
Yeah.
I don't wish that upon anybody, right? And that's
No.
why, as FDNs, we're also passionate about what we do. We want to help our clients to shorten that learning curve so they don't have to
Mhm.
go through what we did.
Well,
And
and
they don't have
everyone.
to take 10 years to learn about mold illness, right?
Exactly. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing on the podcast. If people want to, okay, why am I not talking about your swim, bike, run workouts? There's
Mm,
100 other podcasts talking about how to train. I want to tell you how to be a healthy athlete and work in performance and longevity and learning how giving you the tools through the lab testing and our health coaching, figure out how you can really be the best version of yourself versus just digging yourself into a hole. And I think,
so important.
it's so
Yeah.
important part of training
If
is
you
this
want
other
to,
part.
if you want to perform at a high level, you need to be designing your life around optimizing your mitochondria, right?
Yeah.
That's, in my mind, that's the most important thing for performance because that's how your body produces energy.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're seeing signs of mitochondrial dysfunction, you're not going to be performing up to your top or peak performance. And this all ties back to this mold topic too, because these mold toxins are a significant wrench in the gears of your mitochondrial function, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to have optimal mitochondrial function and top performance, yeah, you've got to address any potential mold and mycotoxins to be getting the machinery working properly again, right? Our
The
bodies are designed
microbiome.
to work, right? This is how I always explain it. Like our bodies are designed to work, and they're designed to function optimally. But when you introduce these inflammatory influences and pathogenic influences, it disrupts your body's normal ability to function. So if we can clear that stuff out, your body knows what to do. It knows how to go back to optimal function.
Yep. I just got to give it the right tools.
That's right.
Right. I got the sun setting in front of me.
Yeah,
But
Jordan. here. So,
Yeah,
guys, for the moody lighting in here.
I know. So thanks, Ryan. If anyone has questions, they can reach out to the podcast, debbiepots.net. And what's your website you want to send people to get learn more?
Yes, the website is themindfulnutrivore.com. And you can also find me at Instagram at themindfulnutrivore. So come meet me over there, send me a message, tell me what's up. Happy, and I try to get back to everybody.
Good. All right. Thanks so much. Have a good evening.
Thanks for having me, Debbie. Appreciate you.
Thanks for listening to the Low Carb Athlete Podcast. If you have any questions, feedback, or topic suggestions, let us know on Facebook or at debbiepots.net. You can help us to continue to grow by leaving a review on iTunes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.